Stanford University.
The Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford University. Reinvigorating gender equality in the 21st century.
I'm very excited to invite you, or to welcome you to this event here today, and I especially want to welcome the panelists that have joined us. We're very much looking forward to this. And as we were mapping this out, you know, I couldn't have imagined the panel that we actually ended up with today, so I'm just thrilled to have you all here. The purpose of the symposium is both to celebrate the success of Ms. Magazine and its contributions to feminism, and also to use the celebration to inspire conversations about the future of feminism and to explore the ways that feminism can help us understand and solve the pressing problems in the United States and in the world, and especially those that affect women and girls. I'll introduce the moderator of the panel, Estelle Friedman. She's going to be moderating the panel. She's the Edgar E. Robinson Professor of History at Stanford. She's well known for her work on U.S. women's history and on the history of feminism, so she's just perfect to be the moderator of this panel. And I'll turn it over to her, and she will introduce the panelists.
Great. Thank you, Shelley. And I just want to thank you. Hello, it's wonderful to see, for me, over 30 years worth of feminists I've known at Stanford in this room. It's terrific. And could I just add some very personal thanks and target Lori McKenzie and Ann Enthoven of Clayman for the organizing that they put into this event. Extraordinary. Now, I have to say it is a huge honor for me to be at the intersection of these generations and to be part of today's what we consider a round table about feminist journalism over the past 40 years and its future direction. To pull from some things that panelists wrote to me, we're particularly interested in the influence of Ms. Magazine in feminist journalism. But we have a broader mission as well to think about the way feminist media have been changing over these decades. And I'm sure that you all are as eager as I am to learn about, as Marcia Gillespie put it, what we were and are passionate about as journalists, the burning issues, and the areas of contention. I'm going to offer the briefest introductions. There's more in your programs to give more time. I also asked the first question to let the speakers situate themselves historically a little bit. So let me just give all of the introductions at the outset again, working chronologically from the earliest editors. So at this end of the table, Suzanne Braun Levine served as the first editor of Ms. Magazine from 72 to 88. And while she was there, she also produced a Peabody Award-winning HBO special about American women in the 20th century. She was the first female editor of the Columbia Journalism Review. She's now a contributing editor of More Magazine, as well as a regular blogger. And her books are outside as well. Marcia Ann Gillespie was editor-in-chief of Essence magazine from 1971 to 1980, where her work won the National Magazine Award. In 1980, she became contributing editor at Ms., then a featured columnist, and from 1993 to 2001, the executive editor. She's the author of Maya Angelou, A Glorious Celebration. She is currently professor of diversity in residence at Bennett College. Helen Zia served as executive editor of Ms. Magazine from 1989 to 1992 after directing several other publications. She is an honorary Doctor of Laws from the City University of New York. She has long been an activist for Asian American and lesbian and gay rights. And she is the author of Asian American Dreams, The Emergence of an American People. Catherine Spillar is the executive vice president of the Feminist Majority Foundation and the current executive editor of Ms. Magazine. She has specialized in investigative reporting, including award-winning coverage of issues such as anti-abortion terrorism and human trafficking, which have influenced congressional legislation. And she is the former president of the LA chapter of the National Organization for Women. Miriam Zoila Perez is an editor at feministing.com, a consultant for the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health, and the founder of the blog Radicadula on birth activism and social justice. Her work appears in Bitch magazine, The Nation, colorlines.com, and her honors include the 2010 Barbara Seaman Award for Activism in Women's Health from the National Women's Health Network. Shelby Knox is a feminist blogger. She's the subject of the 2005 Sundance Award-winning film, The Education of Shelby Knox, about her teenage activism for comprehensive sex education and gay rights in Southern Baptist territory. She is now a, quote, itinerant feminist organizer, quote, for reproductive justice and sexual health, and she is writing a book about the next generation of feminist activism. Okay, everybody, there we go. Everybody. Okay, so my first question is to ask each of you to say very briefly, how did you become involved in feminist journalism and feminist media? Place yourself historically, when or what point in your life, in what capacity, and if there was somebody who influenced you, tell us who and why. And we're going to start at the beginning. Suzanne.
Well, I have never been the chronological beginning of anything before in my whole life. Very strange feeling. Well, I came to Ms., and that to me is synonymous with how I came to feminism. I came to Ms. in 1972 through two routes. One was as a journalist, and the other was as a reader. And when Ms. started, it was this wonderful amalgam of people who were activists, people who were organizers, people who were in politics, people who were writers, and there weren't all that many actual journalists. So what I could contribute was my journalistic background and the fact that I had a system for keeping track of articles, which was a bulletin board with different color cards on it, and everybody was very impressed with that. In fact, it gained me the only private office at Ms. Magazine from day one. And only after I entered the Ms. family did I really understand, even begin to become aware of what feminism was. Obviously, I was ready for it, but I always say that Ms. changed my life, that had I not walked into that office, I would have, I would have been a more ordinary person. It gave me the, it put me face to face with issues and people and important concepts that I had to grab onto. So it was absolutely learning on the job. Now, the way I came to Ms. as a reader was that in the preview issue, there was an article that said, "We have had abortions." Somebody referred to it earlier. And it was a lot of celebrities. Just for some of you, abortion was illegal back then. And a lot of celebrities who basically admitted to a crime. And then on the bottom, there was this little coupon. And it's invited readers to join the list. I looked at that coupon, and I said, I have to fill this out. And that was my secret. And I told my secret, I have had an illegal abortion, to Ms. Magazine. And the beautiful part of this is that by the time all these envelopes came in with the coupons, and there were thousands and thousands of them, it may have been illegal, but it certainly, we found our way, not very happily. I got to open my coupon. So it was just a perfect moment. And I just want to say one thing, because I find this such a moving day. You've given us a gift, I think. And it's the first time that I felt that not only has Ms. endured, and I feel that very strongly, Kathy, but also the spirit of Ms. has endured. And that's even harder to capture. And I felt it at lunch and here. So thank you.
Thank you. Marcia.
Gee.
Yeah.
I can remember when Ms. Magazine came out. I was the editor-in-chief at that time of Essence Magazine. They were not too many doors away from us, working out of New York Magazine, the first issue. And I also recall thinking, so what are they really going to do with this? I came to Ms. Magazine with suspicion. I came with a suspicion as an African-American woman that so much of what had come before Ms. had been, to my mind, way too privileged, way too white, way too something. It wasn't me. My journey to feminism came through people like Toni Cade Bambara and a landmark book that she edited called The Black Woman, which gave voice to what was the experience of me and my sisters who are invisible in America, who were less than human to some Americans, who were being bombarded by black men in the midst of the move for black power, to speak about what were our truths as female human beings and as black female human beings. I came to feminism that way, and I came through the privilege of knowing Fannie Lou Hamer, who, for those of you who don't know, I say you better Google her right now, who was a woman of both conscience and power, who, you know, stood her ground in the state of Mississippi when it was a deadly and dangerous place to be. At the same time, here comes this magazine, and I'm looking at it, and I remember the editors at Essence, we would talk about what was in the magazine, you know, and dissect it, but there was always a piece, some piece, somewhere, that spoke to me. And I went, wow. I got closer to Ms. because Alice Walker was writing there. And like a lot of people, I'm sure, in this room, you know, I mean, what Alice wrote was always something I knew I had to chew on for a while. I came to Ms. Magazine because of Gloria. Because even though there are a lot of the dolls back in those days who called themselves feminists that I did not get at all, I got Gloria. Because Gloria was real. And she was open. And she was and is one of the smartest damn people I've ever met. But she also understood that we rise as a group and not as individuals. So my journey to Ms., you know, was like a lot of people, you know, come in different ways. And then when I made the decision, which my mother, to the day she died, told me was the stupidest damn thing I'd ever done, which was I decided I had done Essence and 10 years was enough and I was leaving, and I was kind of like trying to figure out what I was going to do. This woman would become my friend, you know, reached out to me and said, you know, why don't you become a contributing editor at Ms. And it was the only other place that I felt my heart. Ms. has been part of my heartbeat. I have sometimes been angry with it. I think that we argue with it. There are things I wish that we could have done differently. You know, when I had my little turn to, you know, to edit the magazine, one of the things that I realized is that, you know, we at our best are only following your lead because of the way the letters push us, because of the way the phone calls push us, because of the, I call it the fierce urgency of what it means to be female in this world. That does not get us. So my journey to Ms. came all kinds of ways. And the one thing you learn about Ms. is that once you're part of the family, you can go to Timbuktu. You will always end up still with the family. So, Mrs. Family.
Thank you. Helen.
Well, I'm a little surprised to find myself on this side of the table, let me say, but because I have always looked to these two and the magazines and journalism that you represented to be part of my guiding light. So let me start with that. Having said that, I think we do come from a similar generation, and my journey to feminist journalism really is my journey to feminism and my journey to journalism were quite different paths. And being an Asian American girl growing up during the civil rights period, and that time, which I'll situate in the 50s, ancient times, there weren't women journalists that I could see anywhere. And not on television, not in bylines, not in anywhere. And women who had the greatest skills and talents were clerks and secretaries in journalism organizations. And that, for many, was the path of how they finally broke through when the women's liberation movement happened, and civil rights and affirmative action and all those things. So for me, it never occurred to me to become a journalist as a kid, because I never saw a female face until Jessica Savage, and then Charlene Hunter Galt. And if I had to identify an inspiration, it was Charlene Hunter Galt, who, if you don't know her, you should Google her name, because here she was, an African-American woman, a woman of color, who was on network news, who was talking about very serious things, and she was my inspiration. And really the idea that, oh, maybe I, as a Asian American girl at a time when there were about 500,000 Asian Americans in the USA, a minuscule number, that maybe I would have something to say in this country. And so that was my beginning toward activism. And I have to say I became an activist before I became a journalist, and finding a voice as an activist, and having countless conversations with my fellow male activists about what comes first in the revolution. Do we fight racism or do we fight sexism? And being told over and over again, well, we'll have the revolution and we'll deal with racism first, and later we'll deal with sexism. And having to argue over and over again, why? What are you talking about? What kind of revolution is this? And that was a conversation I had, with my fellow activists of color, the revolutionaries, the Marxists, the socialists, and it didn't have a space for feminism. It really didn't. But I, as a person of color, continued on that path until, which led me to Detroit and becoming an auto worker in Michigan. And in the great layoffs of the Depression of the 1970s and early 80s, that was when I found my voice as a journalist and began writing in Detroit, Michigan, and in the heartland. And it wasn't at a political magazine. It wasn't at a progressive magazines. I went to magazines to be able to give a context and to tell the stories of the many people who were dispossessed in that Depression. And I got to write about the women who were affected, who are, of course, as Gloria says, the canaries in the mines, who were suffering the greatest in that Depression. And wrote about sexual harassment, acquaintance rape when it didn't have a name, and interviewing people who said, what are you talking about? Rape it's not people who know women who rape them, and being able to write about those things. But the North Star, the goal, was to always end up at a place where I could take those views about the equality of all people, including women, and as in my work as a writer, and that was Ms. Magazine. And so I found my way out of Detroit to New York, and then, when you get to Ms., it is a family, and it's a small staff. If you ever hope to be there, somebody has to quit, move, or pass on. And so I remember applying to Ms. Magazine over and over and over again, and just because I knew that's where I wanted to be. In the meantime, I was working as a journalist. I worked at a number of different publications, but ended up in trade journalism and writing about business, editing business, and was an editor-in-chief in a publication when, and Marcia, you probably don't remember, but I think you interviewed me a couple of times, and those opportunities never came up until at that time, we're talking about 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, all the pundits were saying, Ms. is dead, Ms. is dead, and you could see the glee every time, weekly, that they would write their wishful thinking about the death of feminist publication, meaning the death of feminism. So anyway, when it was really about to fold, I got a phone call saying, we have an opening. The good news is if you're interested, you can come here and become managing editor. The bad news is we might not exist in a month. And so I made what I was told was the stupidest decision in my life, which was people were saying, how could you leave being editor-in-chief and at a thriving publication to go to a magazine that is about to fold and go under? And I said, even if I could work on one issue, that is my dream. And I went, and sure enough, the survival of Ms. was quite at stake. And then it was, we were leaving what was called the Australian period, which, later we can talk about the periods of Ms. But the Australian period, and really Gloria and Robin and the founders of Ms. swooped in to save Ms. from the abyss. It really was about to fold. And every one of us had jobs. And by the way, when you see the ball fall on New Year's Eve, that was where Ms. was, at one Times Square, at a time when Times Square was truly a dump. And anyway, so that's how I ended up at Ms., and it really is a family. And I had the pleasure of being at Ms. when advertisers wouldn't advertise with us, so we became ad-free. And what that meant was total unfettered feminism, to write whatever and publish whatever it was we want, and to be as outrageous as we could possibly be. So I'm just delighted that we had this gathering.
Yeah. Kathy, how did you come in?
Well, I must make a confession now. I don't even really consider myself a journalist. So how's that? But I didn't want to say that ahead of time because I wanted to be part of this. Actually, I'm an activist, and started my activism in Now, as you heard, and then was in the right place at the right time and got to be part of the founding of the Feminist Majority Foundation, and came to feminist journalism through one of those periods of, oh my God, Gloria swooping in again to save Ms. And in the late 90s, she had put together another consortium of investors that had tried to, had rescued Ms. from yet its third or fourth commercial publisher who had almost killed it, and brought it back to life as an independent publication, but at a time when magazines were going through yet the latest wave of reorganization, and the industry was taking a heavy toll on many existing magazines. And she came to the Feminist Majority Foundation in 2001 in the fall, in September, I think it was, or August, and said that would we consider taking Ms. magazine on and publishing Ms., that she was looking for a home in the feminist sector, the nonprofit sector, to get it out of the trying to make a profit, trying to sell to the commercial interests. And at first we said no, absolutely not. We don't know anything about magazine publishing. In fact, as an activist, I had spent, and as an organization now in both the Feminist Majority Foundation, constantly trying to influence the media. Our job was to get our message out to the media, and of course during this whole period too, the media had changed radically. Very difficult with the consolidation of the media, and no more women's beats, that was all gone. To even find someone who could cover women's rights issues was getting harder and harder as you got into the late 90s. So after we sort of got our heads about us again, and Peg Yorkin, the chair of the Feminist Majority, is here today. we said, well, why not? We couldn't bear to think, as we were going into the first year of the George Bush administration, that Ms. would indeed ever fold. Couldn't bear to think of it. And because of its history, because of its impact, its influence, the difference it had made, and its role within the larger feminist movement, there was just no way we were going to let that happen. So we took it on. We figured it all out with a lot of help. Suzanne, in fact, you edited the first transition issue, the best of the first 30 years of Ms., which is still a classic. Robin Morgan came back to edit the best of the fiction and poetry of the first 30 years. And we got it back going. I will say that what a difference it makes to have your own media. We don't have to convince anybody that they should be covering some of these critical issues, or frankly, how to cover them. And in fact, owning your own media is great power, because you can not only say it like it is through our feminist lens, but you can influence the way other media is reporting on the issues. It's this big echo chamber out there. And so if you're the first out and you have defined the issue and you get other media to take a look at it, suddenly you have a megaphone. And that is the power of Ms. and why we were just determined it couldn't go away. And so that's how I came to all of it. It's taking on as executive editor. I work with an incredible team on the editorial side. The publishing side is now based out of our Washington, D.C. office. Eleanor Smeal, who couldn't be here today, is our publisher. And we figured it was really, in hindsight, it has been an incredible opportunity to further equality for women and girls, not only here in the U.S., but to give voice to the struggles that women all over the world face and the role of the U.S. in impacting. And we're going after decision makers, policy makers. We are impacting on the agenda of this country through this incredible vehicle called Ms. And we're grateful that we had that opportunity.
Thanks. So, Miriam, where do you come into all this?
Yeah, this is fascinating chronology of sort of feminist media and journalism. You know, I feel like, so I've been blogging for 5 years, and for the last 3 of them, I've also been doing some freelance journalism, primarily in progressive publications online. But so I feel like I'm kind of the beginning of, or in the first waves of sort of the generation of like, sort of leaving behind the gatekeepers and just forging our own path, right? I wouldn't be able to do any of the writing I do if it wasn't for blogging and for online technology, where I was able to really start my voice. So my first feminist media sort of experience was actually not Ms. I didn't tell them this before this panel, but Bitch magazine was actually the first feminist publication that I remember coming across in college, and that, you know, sort of called to me, and I found that really intriguing. It's a publication about pop culture. And then, you know, I didn't blog at all while I was in college. That was still pretty new, and we really weren't online very much when I was in college, which is sort of incredible to imagine now, I know, for students here. And that was only 6 years ago, right, that I graduated. So, but when I left college, I got I was sort of lucky. I got a really good nonprofit organizing job in reproductive justice, working with a Latina organization. And I sat down at my desk on the first day, and anybody who's taken a new job at a nonprofit knows that there's usually kind of a gap before your work really kicks in, you know? And I had a new role, and so basically I was bored for like 2 weeks. And so in those 2 weeks, I was sort of surfing around the internet. And at that time, you know, there wasn't as much to do in that realm as there is now. But the person who had the computer before me had a favorites list on her browser that basically didn't get erased when they gave me the computer. And I don't even use the favorites list anymore, but at that time, that was still part of the way we use the internet. Anyway, feministing was one of the things on the favorites list. I had never seen a feminist blog before. I don't even know if I knew, I mean, I think I knew what blogs were, but I was not a blog reader. And feministing just kind of drew my attention and really pulled me in. And I loved the voice, and I loved the perspective, and I just became a huge fan immediately. Fast forward like 8 months, you know, into my work there, and I ended up at a conference where I was, that was a conference that brought together birth activists and abortion activists. And this is sort of the radical doula side of what I do, which, you know, a different conversation. But I actually met Jessica Valenti, who was the founder of Feministing, at that conference. And I was like, oh my God, you're Jessica Valenti. Like, I totally did the whole swoon thing. And she was very awesome about it, and really humble, and really rad. And at that conference, I also met a couple of other really small feminist bloggers who were like me. You know, they were 20-somethings who had these small blogs where they, put out their perspective, and they really encouraged me to start a blog. So I did, and that was 5 years ago. I started Radical Doula, basically just because I wanted to talk about my politics from a particular perspective. And Jessica from Feministing was a big supporter from the beginning because we'd met at that conference, and she invited a bunch of us to the conference to guest blog. So I guest blog on Feministing about being a radical doula, and that actually encouraged me to start the blog. And so, fast forward about a year, and I ended up becoming an editor at Feministing, and have done that for the last 4 years. And so, very internet age, very informal. Being an editor at Feministing isn't a full-time job. Well, it's a full-time job, but it's a full-time job without pay, basically. So, the conversations about media, Feministing doesn't worry about going under in that, our expenses are pretty low, but we all do this for free, and it's a passion project, but it's definitely a really big challenge, and it's very much indicative of sort of the way media is now and the way particularly online media works. So it's been an amazing ride, but also a lot of struggle to keep that bridge between being an activist and being a journalist. And now I kind of dabble in a bunch of different arenas, and that's very, I think, indicative of where media is now. It's really hard to make a living as a journalist, and so I make a living as a consultant, helping nonprofits be better at online communications, and I blog as my passion and part of my work, and then I do freelance journalism as a passion, mostly because the pay online is so little that it's mostly a loss every time I write an article, but I love it, and it's the stuff that really drives me. So it's a really interesting sort of hybrid, the way that I've kind of come into this work.
Thanks. Shelby.
So, like Kathy, I have an admission. I'm not a journalist. In fact, I'm not even a blogger, really, anymore, although I was. If you would ask people within the feminist space, I don't think I have much influence, but it might be in microblogging spaces, more on Twitter and on Tumblr, and within social media. But I came to this desire to write online and write about feminism through organizing. So I had a film made on me when I was 15, premiered when I was 18 at the Sundance Film Festival. And I come from Lubbock, Texas, so it's not like I was living in a hotbed of feminism. And so I started to be asked to travel across the country to speak at colleges by organizations like Planned Parenthood, NARAL, the Feminist Majority Foundation. And it was really after I was becoming sort of a spokesperson for young feminism that I realized that I was a feminist, or that there was a word for these politics that I had that wasn't the connotation my dad used via Rush Limbaugh, like feminazi, which is an oxymoron. Anyway, and so I was traveling across the country and I was doing these speeches, and I was really terrified in all the spaces because I didn't feel like what I had to say as a woman coming to this movement was going to be very relevant. And I always felt like everyone knew more than I did, and so I'd give my speech really fast, and then I would beg someone else to tell their own story. And someone would, because women usually help each other. And so someone would stand up and say, well, you fought for sex education, but I tried to start a GSA at my school. Or, we fought the rule that you can't wear pants under your graduation, or you can't wear pants in your graduation gown, or we got the coach fired for sexual harassment. And I realized that in every room, when these stories were told, we all left feeling less crazy, less alone, and more pissed off. And that is what feminism is. It's hearing your pain and your struggle and another woman's voice and another person's voice, and suddenly realizing there's nothing wrong with you and there's nothing wrong with her, but there's something wrong with the world that's trying to make you think that there is. And so I realized this, and so I started writing this down because the stories were amazing, and it felt like no one was capturing young women's stories in this very vulnerable state, talking about sexism and racism and the intersections, the oppressions, being queer. But I still didn't think about putting them online, really, because they weren't my stories to share, and I still didn't feel like I didn't have that much to say, or wouldn't be listened to if I was saying it. And so I started blogging when I moved to New York City for two reasons. One was that I didn't think this could be a job forever, traveling across the country and speaking and talking about feminism. I thought this was something I was lucky enough to get away with for a couple years when I was in college. And I happened to meet Gloria Steinem. who is the one who told me I was an itinerant feminist organizer, and that not only was the job, this was our legacy. That we have a history of women who travel across the country and they spread feminism and they spread stories through speaking to each other. It's consciousness raising. And so I was like, wow, this is real and this is relevant. And I suddenly felt like very upset about all those years that I hadn't been putting these out there. Because I should have been sharing these stories with other young women who weren't in those rooms, who were in places like where I grew up in Lubbock, Texas. And didn't have access. And so I started a blog. I knew Gloria at the time and was very influenced by her. And so I started a blog called The Ms. Education of Shelby Knox in tribute to Ms. Magazine and to the legacy of using personal women's stories to help other women understand their own and to help us make the connections that are important in feminism. And also to speak to each other as activists. Because that's something else that Ms. has done. It allowed us as space as feminists to talk to our movement and to challenge our movement. And so I really wanted to put that online and blog in that way. And then the other influence was seeing y'all do it. So I moved to New York and I met Jessica Valenti and I met Miriam and I met Samita, who is the current editor, and Courtney Martin. And I realized that this is our community. This is our generation. Just as y'all are a family and y'all grew the movement together, this is our generation. We are the ones who are growing the movement together, and this is how we're doing that.
Thank you. Thank you. What a, what a round of stories. I wish we could take that depth for all the questions, but I'm going to merge a couple of questions together and ask us to try to do a lightning round now of a couple of the things that I asked you to think about and choose which one you want to give an example of rather than as much in-depth storytelling. And the issues would be, can you identify one of your greatest challenges thus far or area of contention as a feminist, journalist, blogger, activist, or one of your greatest accomplishments? So take one, think for a second about one of those things and then just try to take very short period of time to just put it out there, and then we can see if we have time to go in more depth about it.
Well, it's in the theme of having grown up at Ms., having become who I am at Ms. I think my accomplishment that I would talk about is personal. I'm very, very proud of She's Nobody's Baby, the Peabody Award-winning thing. And I'm amazed that I put one foot in front of the other to produce a documentary for HBO, because it was one of those things where I kept thinking we'll hire somebody, you know, and they'll fix it. But that's a small part of, for want of a better phrase, finding my voice. My situation at Ms. was always that I was the person in the office and everybody else went out and changed the world, which was exactly the way it should be, because that's what we were all good at. But I've always had a hard time speaking up. And when I left Ms., went to Columbia Journalism Review, and then started writing books, I started writing books about the Ms. life experience. I am writing about women like us as we go through our 50s, 60s, and 70s. It's exactly the same mission as I had at Ms. But what's different is that it's my voice. And it seems to me, my theory is you have to get to be 50 before you think you know anything worth saying, but that's not true.
I think that's
only our generation.
I think that's one of the things we're hearing as thinking about it generationally. Let me turn to Marcia. Do you have a accomplishment, contention?
I'll do challenge. Wasn't challenge one of them?
Mm-hmm. Challenge.
Okay, challenge. I think the biggest challenge I had, you know, was that when I became the editor-in-chief of Ms., the question that I was being asked by a lot of my friends was, okay, but, you know, are you gonna, you know, am I gonna feel welcome? And the challenge really was that regardless of what was in the magazine and had been in the magazine, a perception had developed about the magazine and about the movement that was one which was, it was a white woman's thing, still. It's perhaps the thing that still dogs this movement and is perhaps our biggest Achilles heel. And so the challenge I felt was a way to signal, and not just signal, but produce something that made women of color and young women and high-heeled feminists and do you know what I mean? Lesbian feminists and maybe Monday, Wednesday, and Friday feminists feel like they had a stake in the magazine. So for me, that was the thing I took on as my challenge.
Thank you. Helen.
Well, in thinking about this question, I was thinking that challenge and passion really go together. And the challenges that Marcia was talking about, I think, really were, as she says, still exist for the feminist movement, and maybe I'll take it into the magazine a little bit more in the sense that, you know, women who come to feminism, men who come to feminism, but especially women who come to feminism and come to a magazine like Ms. come with very passionate, strong feelings. We want to change the world. We see so many places of inequality and injustice, and here at Ms., you know, I came thinking that this was the place where those voices could find a place in 100 words at 100 pages every 2 months. And of course, that means that all those passions are going to come in, and you know, you want to talk about drama? Talking about what goes in the magazine and what gets kept out was drama every day at Ms. And there was a lot of, can I say, unhappiness when people felt that, you know, taking those feelings of injustice in as well. And so feelings about where feminism, or what is viewed as feminism, doesn't address race or doesn't address sexual orientation, or can we use the word lesbian in the magazine, and how are we going to deal with being attacked, by which we were regularly, if you know anything hinted at lesbians was in the magazine. And I remember, because we actually had a policy under Robin Morgan's editor-in-chiefness, was that if there was an article about a particular group, we would first find a writer from that group. So if we were going to write about lesbians, we would find a lesbian to write that. And that became news, like headline news, and Reader's Digest, and the Washington Post, and Howard Kurtz, and all the media pundits said, Ms. says only lesbians can write about lesbians, which was totally not the issue. And it wasn't the point. And meanwhile, it was the anniversary of World War II, when they were finding World War II veterans to write, men to write about World War II, and they couldn't make the leap. And you know, and every day there were things like that. And I did bring on the challenge was, you know, being a woman of color at Ms. and being a woman of color who says I'm a feminist and not afraid to use the F word. You know, within the different communities that we all, and the tribes that we all belong to, you either have to defend yourself, or you have to explain, or you have to argue. And within Ms., we would have those arguments too. And so, you know, what goes on the cover and who goes on the cover? And so that was a battle we actually had. Mother's Day was coming up, and so this is just one example. Mother's Day was coming up, and we wanted to find mother and daughter feminists. And so as the executive editor at that time, I felt my responsibilities was to find as many diverse couples of mothers and daughter feminists as we could possibly find. And we had great, you know, mothers and daughters from all different communities, but then who would go on the cover? And we had this fabulous activist mother, Shamita Das Gupta, and her feminist daughter, Santayana Das Gupta. and they were South Asian, they are South Asian women. And the question was, and we actually had this discussed, and somebody said, well, will our core readership accept these women on the cover? Which translated obviously means they're not white. Will white feminists accept this? And so being at a time when we didn't have advertising, so we didn't have to have an ad on the back of the magazine, we solved that by having another set of mothers and daughters on the back. But this was the kind of issue that came up constantly and continues to, whether it's 100 pages every 2 months or 200 words in in a blog, or how many in a tweet. And so.
Thank you. Accomplishment, challenge, passion. What is it going to be?
I'm going with accomplishments.
Okay.
We've taken on much more of the investigative reporting since Feminist Majority Foundation took over publishing Ms. And I'm very, very proud of the impact that we've had on 4 key investigative pieces that we've done. And for those of you who have been watching Ward Connerly and his whole anti-affirmative action movement unravel on the pages of the New York Times and the LA Times and probably the San Francisco papers, and the scandals that have now become very public about how the millions he was raising for his anti-affirmative action campaigns, that a huge percentage of the money went into his own pocket. I want to tell you that Ms. Magazine broke that story 3 years ago. And it took the New York Times only 3 years to catch up. But I am very, very proud of that work. And it was an incredible effort. We did a 9-month investigation of the murder of Dr. George Tiller. And 1 year after his murder, published a groundbreaking investigative story about the network of extremists that I believe, and as the Feminist Majority Foundation, we have been fighting anti-abortion extremists for our 25 years, and then plus before that now. I believe the man, Scott Roeder, did not act alone, and we made that case. And I know that at the Department of Justice it was read thoroughly. In fact, we got a call, Jessica Stites, who's joined us, our associate editor, before it ever left the printer, asking for an advance copy of the article. So I know it has influenced the way that law enforcement understands this extremist movement in this country that is attacking women's health care providers. Most recently, we had a cover story 1 year ago, this coming spring, titled Rape is Rape. And we were exposing how the FBI statistics on rape undercounted the incidence of rape in this country by a factor of at least 10 and probably more, because of its definition of rape was developed in the 1920s. And it left out so many different types of rape. We went with the cover story. The Feminist Majority Foundation had launched a whole campaign. This is the power of media, joined by change.org. It went viral. We sent over 160,000 letters and emails to the head of the FBI, Robert Mueller, and to the Department of Justice, to Attorney General Eric Holder. We had people at the meetings of the FBI committee making a decision about to expand the definition, update it finally. One of our people was pulled over by an FBI official and said that, I can tell you we count the emails every day. They'd never seen anything like it, and they have just announced they have updated the definition after 82 years.
Miriam?
Yeah. So continuing my theme of kind of like online feminism and online feminist media, I think there's something I want to talk about that's both, I think, a challenge and an accomplishment, and that's kind of the way in which online feminism has decentralized the movement. I think it allows for multiple voices, right? Many, many voices to kind of exist and coexist and reach different audiences. Compared to the sort of the traditional media voice, the traditional media always wants like, okay, Gloria Steinem, you speak for feminism. Tell us what feminism is about, right? Like there's got to be this one spokesperson, or maybe there's like 5, maybe 10, but it's like a very centralized sort of model in media especially. And so I think that's been one of the sort of really big accomplishments of the way online feminism has changed, is that it's not, obviously traffic and voices and views still kind of aggregate, and there's certain views and voices that get more attention, but there's this plethora of conversation. And one of the things that I think it addresses some of the challenges that, I mean, the challenges as well, but it addresses some of the challenges brought up that, you know, different people can speak for different feminisms and their feminism and how their feminism connects to the issues that they care about. And I think that's really how it's an accomplishment, and that's one of the ways in which feminism really benefits from being sort of decentralized and being everywhere, right? So that in the environmental justice movement, a person can talk about how that's where their feminism happens because they bring a gender lens to the work they're doing around pollution, or in the reproductive justice movement, or in the immigration movement. Like, it allows that gender lens to get there. And that's really powerful, and I think that really elucidates what intersectional feminism looks like, right? That you don't have to boil your feminism down to the cover of one magazine, right? That it can be seen in many, many places. But obviously it's also a challenge, right? Because A, nobody sees it, and you get a million people always asking, where's feminism, where's feminism, where are all the young feminists, is feminism dead, you know? Like, that rhetoric never ends. It's also a challenge because how do you have an agenda in a decentralized movement, right? You can't get everyone at a table and say, hey, what's the feminist agenda, if we actually literally are everywhere, right? Or are infiltrated. And maybe we're places where we're not wearing a "this is what a feminist looks like" t-shirt, but we're still bringing a gender lens to our work, which to me is feminism, right? So I think, you know, there's two huge sides of it that really both push and improve, I think, the feminist movement. And that's kind of the crux of where things are with online feminist media.
Shelby.
I'm going to do passion.
Good.
Because I'm an amateur feminist historian. I should not say that in a room of academics. I'm an amateur. And I love this movement and the history of this movement. And I'm very, very conscious that feminist history is something that we're making. And that much of the history of what came before has been lost because it wasn't considered important by the mainstream, or because it wasn't saved. And so I am very, very passionate about using the online platform to memorialize, to expose what millennial feminist organizing looks like. That it's not only blogging or tweeting, but there are young women running the personhood campaigns, there are young women running the queer liberation movement, and they're on the ground, and they're organizing marches, and they're clinic escorts, and telling those stories, not only so that right now I can say, when someone says, where are all the young feminists, there are all of these examples of what that means and looks like, but so that in 20 years, we have that vital part of our history to show the next ones who are going to come up and say, well, what did you do for feminism? And there it is, memorialized, because it is our history and it is important.
Thank you. As a historian, I thank you for archiving. So what I'd like to do this round is start at the other end of the table and, again, trying to go putting all the ideas out there, and then we'll open it up for discussion after this round, which is, where would you like to see feminism and feminist media, feminist journalism go in the future, whether pick either content or formats or its influence. If there's a main challenge you want to throw into that, but I'll ask you each to try to be as concise as you can, and again, so that we can then open it up to you talking to each other a little bit. And I'll just start with you, Shelby, and work our way. Actually, let me give this table to start, and if anybody feels like I follow from that, we can mix it up, but give it a start.
Sure. So this is something that y'all have been struggling with for a long time, but it is imperative to make feminist journalism and the feminist movement sustainable. We cannot do this without getting paid. We cannot do this on a nickel and a prayer. And there are a lot of ways that we can do this. We have, across history created our own foundations, but we need to be creating more of our own, starter funds for women entrepreneurs who are doing specifically feminist ventures. We need to start figuring out different ways to monetize our blogs that we can pay the bloggers who are doing that. We need to change the way that we organize and the way that we fundraise for our organizing. We've siloed ourselves in a way in the feminist movement, so that we have this small resource, this pool of resources. And so I think that to remain relevant and, well, we'll always be relevant, but to remain radical and visible, it's our responsibility to take on these challenges.
I like to talk about something I call feminism's identity crisis. And I say this as a 27-year-old with my perspective of that, that's my perspective, and that's how long I've been, involved in this movement. But I think that there's kind of a crux we're reaching right now with a generational shift. And I think it comes from the successes of feminism, right? Like I would say that, I have benefited incredibly from the successes of the feminists before me and the feminists in this room, and that this builds off of the successes, not necessarily the deficits of feminism, which is often where the conversation starts. But so feminism has succeeded and has achieved so much in the last, 50, 100 years, however you want to categorize the movement. And I think that's changed sexism. I think sexism has really shifted and adapted to the successes of feminism, right? And has continued to update itself to continue, I'm sort of personifying it, right? It's not that simple, and I think the feminist movement is trying to shift to adapt to the new sexism that young people especially experience. And it's not the same sexism, right? Like we're in the boardroom, right? We're in the workplaces where a lot of those doors have been busted down. But sexism is not dead, right? We experience that. And for me, I think that part of that crux has to do with what I said about, gender analysis spreading away from just feminism and into every sort of area of social justice and in our world, so that people can apply it to the work that they do in their community and their identity. But I think it's also about gender and like the way in which gender identity is shifting, and people, there's a lot of kind of movement around these questions of gender that have been being asked for a really long time. But I think that it really is connected to sexism and the frame that feminism uses around gender. So this idea of a women's equality movement, I think that we're looking for a shift a little bit there around, particularly to address the issues of sexism. In my personal view, away from a more binary sense of gender, of men versus women, right? And more sort of working toward a world where people are not limited by their gender identity, period, right? Men, women, any way people identify. Kind of to address a little bit of how sexism, I think, is a little bit more nuanced now, right? Than it has been in the past because of the successes of this movement.
Terrific, thank you.
I want to see us in equal numbers at all the decision-making tables. It'll make a very big difference in this world, whether it's in academia or the professions or government or business. We are constantly reminded about the inequality still and how difficult at this stage of this most contemporary wave of feminism that we're up against. In some ways, I think this is the hardest. Sex discrimination, sexism is so much more subtle. Discrimination is more subtle in so many different ways. And to be able to have real power, I think, is the next big challenge. How can we get equal numbers of women who overwhelmingly will be feminists at those tables where those decisions are made? We can really change the world.
There is so much of a how much has changed, but how much hasn't changed, and that we still are dealing with the same old sexism in the culture, the misogyny. Yes, it's mutated and it takes different forms, and also that there are messages out there that young women and girls don't really need to worry about these things because somebody else has taken care of it. Another wave it's already done, and with the nonprofit organizations I work with, for example, one is the Women's Media Center, which was actually founded by Gloria Steinem and Robin Morgan, among others. The reason it came together is because the voices of women just weren't being heard on Sunday morning talk shows, especially after 9/11. That the idea of nationalism and militarism and strength was all men. So actually the number of women's voices was declining, and this is, in this new millennium. And so that's a conversation that's been going on. And to me, the only way to change that is to have more and more. And, from all of the new technologies that are out there, the Ms. and the other publications, and I wish Bitch was still around. That was a great,
it still is around.
But in another, yeah. But right, so all of these everybody has the potential to be out there with the new technologies and these voices and to show the outrage. Robin Morgan has a article that just came out on Women's Media Center about Occupy and what about women and the Occupy movement and the unreported sexual assaults that happen at these campouts, and what about when nobody has a voice, where do women go? And so these are all questions I think that still exist, but the point is on the where we are today is that we have more opportunity and more tools in our hands to be there, to change that, to change the culture and to turn it around. And bringing the money, the resources, the woman power to do that. It's great that Ms is celebrating its 40th, but Ms isn't the only thing. It's just representing how much that has been accomplished and how much more there is to accomplish and do, just looking at all the woman power here in this room and feminist power in this room.
I would come back to, in much the way that you started, Helen, that, you know, the saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And that, you know, absolutely, I do see the change, and I do know that change has happened. But I'm also aware of the fact that, you know, many years ago, the late Dorothy Height, who was the head of the National Council for Negro Women, we were doing a co-speaking event, and I had gotten very into, you know, the fact that we were, you know, busy breaking through the ceiling, and she was, you know, stopped and reminded me about the floor. And I think that one of the big challenges that we face now is that we are in a country that does not want to acknowledge the floor. And that's as true, I think, within our movement in some ways as it is in general. In that while all experiences matter, until we are really ready to confront what poverty means and feels like, and the impact it has on millions of women in this country, and the similarities between what it feels like in this country and what it feels like in every other country, we're not going to make any progress. And I feel that this is especially challenging for feminist journalists. Again, because it's about, I will call it Robin's rule. We need people who are living it to tell the truth about it. And we need to provide them with access to be heard. But we have to do something else. And that is, with all due respect to all of you all in Stanford, love you, bringing me out here and everything. And you know I'm teaching, but not at Bennett now, another college, but that's okay. We also need to be more aware of the need to make the movement accessible and the language that we use about the movement accessible. There are some of the smartest feminists in the world in the academy, but a lot of you have forgotten how to talk to regular folk, so that it doesn't matter a damn how good your research is or how much you know if you cannot make that knowledge open and available to just regular folk, because we're not going to move the dime unless we move it by making people, everyday people, not people with degrees, not people with big bank accounts, but the people who are being mowed down in this society feel that we have a stake in their lives and that they have one in ours. That's my passion. I'm done with that.
Okay. Well, if you folks ever wanted to go to a Ms. editorial meeting, this was it. This was it. And then what do you do with it? How do you pick up these wonderful ideas and find a way to put them in the same place and to get people pissed off? And two things are haunting me. One is the generation thing, and we've talked about it, Shelby. There is this is a continuing misunderstanding between our generation of feminists and yours, for want of a better, the tables, you know. And there's this sense on one, you know, I hear feminists my age say, oh, they're not doing anything, they're not organizing. It makes me crazy. And they say, oh, all you want is for us to be thankful for all you did, right?
Ever said that to me, for the record.
But the thing is that you are doing, and here comes the technological thing, you are doing your thing online. And many of the older feminists aren't as engaged online. So there's this sense, for example, Courtney Martin once described to me, I said, why don't you do marches? And she said, well, March takes 6 months to organize. We can put out a blast in what was it, Sears? Some kind of T-shirt?
Walmart, the panties, the girls' panties.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was some underwear that said, there were preteen underwear in a Walmart. It said, who needs credit cards on the front, on the crotch. And a reader sent that to Feministing from a Walmart in North Carolina. We posted it with the information of the Walmart, and by the next day, Fox News had picked it up. And by the next day, the underwear was gone from the shelves.
It's an amazing story. So I think there's a real need to keep working on this generational thing, and I don't know how to do it. The other thing I worry about is what you were saying as a virtue, which it is a virtue, that there are all these nooks and crannies now, and the issues are they're niche, and people can find their place that fits exactly what is their personal experience of feminism. But what I worry about, and this is what I think Ms. still has to do, is to find those niches and pull them together. We have to learn about each other. And one of the great things that Ms., through all of this turmoil, and I'm glad you made it clear that we were not always a happy family, tried to do was to find as many pieces as possible of women's world and bring it to people who weren't living that experience. And I don't think you can do that in blogs. So I think there has to be some kind of another way in to the understanding of each other's lives. And certainly Ms. is there, but there have to be other ways too.
I'd say one thing in closing, just as an observer and perhaps as a historian, that I heard across the line that I'd like to reiterate, which is from the early years of Ms. through the reincarnations of Ms., through the pleas of the younger feminist activists and bloggers, sustainability seems like the recurrent theme. How do we, as a movement, sustain our feminist media? And I leave it as a challenge to you of all generations to think how you can invest in supporting the print media, the activists, and, as you say, getting paid for doing the blogging and the activism that younger women are doing, so that when these young women are not just 13 and 14 and having little time, but that they'll be able to make careers of this activism. With that, thank you, panelists, and thank you, audience, for this wonderful experience.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.